Films shattered the Victorian conspiracy of silence surrounding sex, surrounding divorce, surrounding prostitution, surrounding political corruption, and the like. Films like The Sins of the Father and Damaged Goods described the horrors of syphilis and gonorrhea. Public outrage over the supposed black plague of venereal disease was accompanied by a crusade against white slavery, forced prostitution. In the early 20th century, every city in the United States had a red light district, a legal district set aside for prostitution. The most famous was Storyville in New Orleans, where over $1 million a week was said to be spent on prostitution. In Chicago, authorities said that $15 million a year was spent on prostitution. Prostitution may have been illegal, but it was tolerated by politicians, police, landlords, and owners of saloons and breweries. In New York, graft payments to permit prostitution to operate totaled between $4 and $5 million a year. During the 19-teens, city after city closed down red light districts and ordered medical inspection of prostitutes. Hollywood took an active role in this anti-vice crusades with films denouncing prostitution like The Girl Who Went Astray, The Traffic in Souls, Inside of the White Slave Trade, and The House of Bondage. So what Hollywood is doing is not so much acting independently as a reformist element, but bringing public concerns to a new level of visibility. Now, sexuality was one of Hollywood's great concerns from the start, and if any figure personified this, it was this woman, who we'll see on our overhead projector, please. What's her name? Anybody recognize this actress? Theda Bara. Theda Bara. She was supposed to be from Egypt. She was actually Jewish and from Cincinnati, but who's to tell the difference, right? She was the symbol of forbidden sexuality. She played a character known as the vamp. A vamp, what's a vamp? A female temptress who lures men to their deaths. Vamp is short for vampire. Such women were supposedly nothing less than she-devils. We'll talk more about sexuality when we talk about gender in a later class. Narcotics drugs were another subject of concern. In 1900, if you wanted a stimulant or a painkiller, you simply went to the corner druggist and you bought opium or its derivative, morphine. Coca-Cola's formula involved the use of cocoa leaves. 1 out of every 400 Americans was an addict at the turn of the 20th century. After the turn of the century, the United States discovered that it had become one of the most drug-afflicted nations in the world, and sweeping legislation was proposed to stamp out narcotics. Hollywood produced many films illustrating the dangers of drugs, but they also, of course, exploit the public fascination with drugs. Rube in an opium joint, the opium smugglers, the cocaine traffic, and on and on. Hollywood always can have it both ways, right? It can be moralistic and denounce something even at the same time that it exposes it to public view. Alcohol, too, drew the attention of reformers and movie makers. In December 1900, a stout woman in her mid-50s marched into the Cary Hotel in Wichita, Kansas. She swept the decanters from the hotel's bar. She hurled a billiard ball at the plate glass mirror behind the bar. She was then placed in the county jail. what's her name? You've all heard of her. Carrie Nation. She was president of the Barber County Women's Christian Temperance Union. She called herself a home defender. And as early as 1901, the Edison Company made 2 films about her exploits, The Kansas Saloon Smashers and Why Mr. Nation Wants a Divorce. In 1 square mile of Chicago, there were 400 saloons. In Wilkes-Barre, Pennsylvania, there were 10,000 saloons in 1906. In 1912, Americans spent $250 million on drink, 11 times more than they spent on education. Middle-class men and women with a sense of mission wanted to suppress drinking. They regarded saloons as centers of gambling and prostitution. During the teens, Hollywood produced film after film not only denouncing drink, but also denouncing political corruption, the vileness of prisons, the horrors of convict labor, the cruelty of the whipping post, the evils of capital punishment. Other common screen topics included loan sharking, child labor, class conflict. The movies were a window on society, and it was as if curtains that had hidden whole aspects of American life are now suddenly brought into public gaze. Silent movie makers often took their ideas from newspapers. Many workers, illiterate or foreign-born, read no newspapers, and so the Nickelodeon became a source of knowledge as well as a source of entertainment. Surveys showed that almost 3/4 of the audiences of Nickelodeons came from the working class. So the movies met their needs and responded to their concerns. So many silent films before the 1920s were social problem films, or what we might call message films. They had a moral that they were trying to get across. They played on people's sense of outrage. They were designed to make people feel ashamed or indignant. And then, after World War I, the nature of silent film changed. The idea of using films to preach or to propagandize or to convey hard news, all this fell into disfavor. The new goal of film was to entertain. The moralism, the Victorian sentimentality, the reformism of early film began to disappear. And instead, film began to emphasize new themes: glamour, sophistication, athleticism, exoticism, urbanity, and sex appeal. The movies were truly transformed. New kinds of movie stars arose in the 1920s. Greta Garbo became the epitome of the mysterious sex goddess. Rudolph Valentino personified the Latin lover. Clara Bow, the it girl, exuded innocent sexuality. This is quite different than those pictures that I showed you earlier. Douglas Fairbanks epitomized the breezy, urban, athletic male. So let's talk for a second about some of these key actors and actresses and see what we can learn both about them and about the society that embraced them. Because the 1920s are truly America's era of celebrity. It is a decade in which Americans embraced movie stars and athletes in a way it never had before. People, for the first time, are finding their entertainment and even maybe their meaning in these celebrities. Douglas Fairbanks ran and jumped through the silent movies of the 20s like a hyperactive schoolboy in the largest playground of all, Hollywood. Banisters were made to be slided down, chandeliers to swing from, walls to be scaled, furniture to be vaulted over, windows to dive through. He was the first swashbuckler. His dazzling smile flashed like a sword. He moved with speed, strength, and grace, and he would be followed by many similar actors in the future like Errol Flynn or Antonio Banderas in our time. But it was Fairbanks who brought this athletic figure to the screen. In 1919, he was one of 4 major figures in Hollywood who formed their own studio, United Artists, because they wanted more independence. Then in 1920, he married America's sweetheart. He married Mary Pickford, the most popular actress of the time. When they honeymooned in Europe, the police had to protect them from the crowds. For the first time, you have celebrities who are truly global celebrities. They're as popular in Europe as they are in the United States. Returning to the United States, they established themselves as the king and queen of Hollywood. They built a giant mansion, Pickford, an 18-acre Tudor-style estate in Beverly Hills. Fairbanks was just 5'8", weighed 160 pounds, but he was an accomplished boxer, gymnast, swimmer, horseback rider, fencer, and tennis player. He walked with an athletic bounce. He exuded energy and confidence. But of course, this is all covering up deep insecurities of a man who craved attention. It's interesting to me that if you look at who becomes president of the United States, you tend to find a common pattern. Sure, there are people like John Kennedy or George Bush who come from wealthy families, but most presidents don't come from wealthy families. Indeed, many of our recent presidents either lost their father before they were born or never really knew their father, or their father was an alcoholic. That's true of Clinton. It's true of Jerry Ford. It's true of Ronald Reagan. You can go on and on with that list. People who become president have deep needs, needs that can only be met by becoming president. Same thing's true in Hollywood. The people who became the early actors and actresses in Hollywood had terrible, terrible childhoods, and they were driven to find new personas. They were driven to find the affection and adoration that they never got as children. They needed Hollywood, and somehow the audience sensed that. Somehow the audience knew that these people needed affection. So let's talk first about Douglas Fairbanks. He was born Douglas Allman, right? Like most actors and actresses in Hollywood, they're truly self-made people who embrace a new name. His father was a prominent Jewish attorney who left home when Douglas was 5 years old. His father never married his mother. Throughout his life, Fairbanks was deeply secretive about his real name, about being half Jewish, about the fact that he was born out of wedlock. Because his father was a heavy drinker, his mother made him sign a temperance pledge at the age of 12, and he remained a teetotaler all his life. Ironically, Mary Pickford would become an alcoholic, and this would be a great source of tension in their relationship. He left school at the age of 15, but he would claim to have studied at Harvard. He claimed that he had fought bulls in Spain. It's all made up, but that's sort of the Hollywood way, right? It was disclosed after his death that he hadn't performed many of the stunts that were attributed to him. They had been performed by doubles. This illusion is what Hollywood is, of course, all about. He never outgrew his small boy's penchant for showing off. He didn't make the movies until he was 33 years old. His early pictures were social satires. In his first United Artists film, His Majesty the American, he plays a wealthy New Yorker who's heir to a European throne. Wasn't John Goodman in a film like that not so long ago? But he would make his reputation as a swashbuckling hero. In When Clouds Roll By, 1919, he's pursued by giant-sized versions of the food he had eaten at dinner. In The Mollycoddle, 1920, he leaps from a cliff to the top of a tree, hurling himself on the villain. Then he rolls down a hill and over a waterfall before he emerges victorious. What could be better than that? But it was as Zorro and D'Artagnan in The Three Musketeers, and ultimately as Robin Hood, that he would truly capture the public imagination. Why do you think Americans were so attracted to these figures? What's the appeal? What do you think? Any thoughts about what it is about those characters that would have a kind of magnetic attraction from the public? You have to press your button, I'm sorry.
They're helping the common people?
That's clearly part of it. I mean, the subtext is there. It is sort of political. But is there something about the figure, too, maybe that might explain why these are so attractive? I think as people live more urban, bureaucratic lives, as their lives become much more circumscribed, as life becomes more dull and boring, we love this image of the Clark Kent who becomes Superman. We love this image of this total freedom that these kind of figures portray. Robin Hood had one of the biggest sets ever conceived for a silent picture. I mean, it's interesting to me that silent sets were often much more elaborate than anything we have today. Currently in the desert outside of Los Angeles, you may know, they're holding an archaeological dig of a Cecil B. DeMille set that will become a national park when it's unveiled. It was all made out of paper mache, so I'm not quite sure how we're going to preserve any of this. But when they dig it up, we'll have better than ancient Egypt. We'll have Hollywood's version of ancient Egypt. But Robin Hood had a set. They built a castle with 90-foot walls. 500 workers were necessary to construct this. Hidden trampolines allowed Douglas Fairbanks to leap across a 15-foot moat. It's great. The set for The Thief of Baghdad in 1924 cost $2 million. There was even a magic carpet suspended by piano wires from a crane. The Black Pirate was a two-toned Technicolor movie. It contained the silent screen's most spectacular stunt. You've all seen this. He jumps, he takes his sword, he slashes through the sail and lands on the deck. It is great. I mean, what could be a better stunt than that? Let's move on next to another one of these silent figures who had so much appeal to Americans in the 1920s. His name was Rudolph Valentino, and he became the personification of the Latin lover. He was the most popular actor of the 1920s. And yet, today, he simply seems like an oddity to us. And when you see his films, it becomes almost impossible to imagine what his appeal was. He wore a turban and tons of eyeshadow in The Sheik. He played a Spanish bullfighter in Blood and Sand. If we could have the overhead projector, please. He was a tango dancing fool dressed as an Argentine gaucho in, I guess, let's see if we can find this picture. Excuse me. In The Four Horsemen of the Apocalypse. He was one of silent film's greatest stars. He later would put on a powdered wig to play an 18th century French nobleman, and his fans rejected him. Something has happened to Valentino, the movie magazine photo play complained. He doesn't look a bit dangerous to women. Valentino is proof that one generation's sex symbol is another generation's campy curiosity. He was one of silent movie's greatest stars, but today he would fit perfectly in a Mel Brooks parody, rather than in People magazine's Sexiest Man Alive. If we could have the overhead projector again. Here you can see him in The Sheik. Another picture from The Sheik. Yet another. This was Romance, 1920s version. He lacked subtlety, even considering the exaggerated gestures in silent film. When he wasn't dueling or dancing, he acted by posing in elaborate costumes and popping open his eyes to show emotion. Love, hate, surprise, any emotion at all, he showed by popping his eyes. But there was something about him that appealed to his time. He seemed artificial, exotic. There was a splash of machismo and a whiff of androgyny, and somehow he spoke to the hidden desires of his time. His career was extremely short. It lasted just 5 years, from 1921 until his death at 31 in 1926. It was a hedonistic time in Hollywood, but actors and filmmakers' licentiousness, which we'll talk about in a later class, arrived on screen cloaked in conventional morality. So while the films seemed like daring sexual fantasies by our standards, they're nothing of the sort. Valentino remains a familiar image despite the fact that his films are very difficult to see. They're not available on video. He's a sort of cultural icon now, even though he's completely divorced from the films that made his reputation. He arrived in Ellis Island from Italy in 1913. He became a paid tango partner in New York City dance halls and eventually made his way to Hollywood, where he got bit parts as villains and gigolos. And then his career took off when he danced the tango in Four Horsemen of the Apocalypse. He played a reluctant hero in World War I. First, he gets to be a libertine. He's the son of an Argentine mother and a French emigre father. He leaves his gaucho costume behind when the family moves to Paris. He wears a tuxedo. He has slicked back hair. Half-naked women pose for him as he becomes an artist. He becomes an instructor at the Tango Palace and falls in love with a beautiful young woman married to an older man. After these glamorous scenes, he, of course, must die. Can't have infidelity in these movies. He returns as a ghost to shake his finger at the young woman and encourage her to remain true to her husband. All kinds of mixed messages in a film like that. Silly as it sounds, the film was considered an extravagant, powerful accomplishment. There were effective battle scenes and symbolic images of the four horsemen from the book of Revelations. It was a very popular film for its period. So you have everything that Americans could have wanted. You have an exotic-looking playboy and a moralistic hero all rolled into one. And he would play that role again and again until his death. In 1921, 3 more Valentino films were released: The Sheik, The Conquering Power, and Camille. The Sheik featured a confrontation between the exotic Latin male and the Nordic virgin, a confrontation resolved by rape. Men didn't care for Valentino. To many, he was, quote, a pink powder puff, as one magazine put it. But women made up the majority of the film audience in the 1920s, and he somehow appealed to that huge female audience. This is the one time in Hollywood history when the overwhelming majority of the audience is made up of women. And so many of the films of the 20s very much are speaking to women's needs, women's fantasies, women's aspirations, and the like. Now, the story of Valentino's private life is complicated. He had married Jean Acker, a lesbian actress who was more successful than he. They married on a whim. She slammed the door in his face on their wedding night. In 1926, he was in New York on tour to promote The Son of the Sheik when he died. Thousands of women passed through Frank Campbell's funeral chapel for 3 days. People ignored the actual reason he had died. He had died of complications of a gastric ulcer. But he somehow appealed enormously to people of the time. Now, the next figure we're going to talk about was the most popular actress of the 1920s, Clara Bow, who was known as the It Girl. What did It stand for? It stood for sex appeal. And she was the sort of Julia Roberts of her time. Let me quickly show you a couple of pictures of her. This is from the first Academy Award-winning picture, Wings. And here you can see her. She had red hair, which you can't tell from this, unfortunately. We have a very brief film clip that I wonder if it would be possible to show briefly. This is from her 1927 film, It, and I think you'll get a sense of why she was so popular. Let's see if this works. There she is. That's her new boss working. She gazes longingly. That's enough of that. As you can tell, it's a sort of Cinderella story that was enormously popular at the time. He misunderstands her. She has a friend who has a baby. He thinks she has had the baby out of wedlock, so he can't marry her. And it's not until the very end of the movie that he finds out the truth. She was the biggest star of her time. She was truly the Julia Roberts or Cameron Diaz of the 1920s. In May of 1928, she received 33,727 fan letters. I mean, simply extraordinary. A record for any star up until that time. She was the it girl, the epitome of jazz-age screen sexuality. She made 37 movies in 5 years. This girl, said F. Scott Fitzgerald, was the real thing, someone to stir every pulse in the nation. Now, with most silent stars, it's very difficult for us to understand why they were popular. You look at Rudolph Valentino, and it's not so easy to tell why people responded to him. But with Clara Bow, there's no question why people responded to her. The basis of her appeal is readily apparent. She had truly an incandescent personality that comes right across on the screen. She's filled with energy, she's filled with dynamism, and she is literally filled with sex appeal. And that's anything but what her real life was like. She was born in Brooklyn. She was probably raped by her father when she was a teenager. Her mother was mentally unstable. Her mother had thrown a child who had died out just in a trash can outside their apartment. Her mother tried to kill her with a kitchen knife. I mean, this is a pretty unpleasant way to grow up. And again, of course, it should remind us that the dysfunctionality of the modern family is nothing new. It has a long history to it. Bow sought refuge in movie-going and in the hope that if she only could become a movie star, she'd have all the love and affection she needed. She made her entry into Hollywood via a contest sponsored by a fan magazine. It was even true back then. You didn't need Publishers Clearinghouse to have those fantasies. She appeared at first in a series of forgettable films, Who Gets Her Man, even if she has to bludgeon him on the head. Her voice was adequate for sound, but she was very, very insecure, despite the appearances that you saw. And the machinery necessary for talking pictures traumatized her. She would get it. Excuse me? No, she actually didn't. She had a sort of Brooklyn accent, as you would expect. But her voice would have been okay. But she slowly seems to go mad. She gets involved in one messy scandal after another. One rumor had it that she slept with the entire Southern California football team. The public got very tired of this after a while. She turned into a timid recluse who feared even the most casual contact with strangers. So the very needs that drove her to get to Hollywood, that I think really did transform her into a star, were the same demons that would eat her up. So I have a feeling she's not all that different, say, from Julia Roberts in her own very different way. So in the 1920s, you have movie stars of extraordinary appeal. And at the same time that these new stars arose, new film genres appear. You have swashbuckling romantic adventures. You have blockbusters like The Ten Commandments with its cast of thousands and dazzling special effects. Audiences were spellbound by these new genres. Sex comedies revolved around the issue of marital fidelity. You had sophisticated dramas examining the manners, morals of the well-bred. You had tales of flaming youth and the new sexual freedom. So from the highly politicized films of the 19-teens, you have a new emphasis on glamour, beauty, youth, new morality in the films of the 1920s. Above all, slapstick comedies were popular. They relied on sight gags. They starred Chaplin, Buster Keaton, Harry Langdon, Harold Lloyd. And these slapstick comedies provide the most devastating social commentary of the 1920s films. They spoof the pretensions of the wealthy, and they present sympathetic portraits of the working class. So why do movies change in the 1920s? Why the new obsession with glamour as opposed to the concern with politics? And the answer has to do with a fundamental shift in the economic structure of the movie industry. Before the 1920s, the American film industry was a cottage industry. It consisted of hundreds of independent filmmaking companies. Filmmaking was extraordinarily competitive during that early period. Few agreed about what a movie should be. How long should a movie be? Should movies use stars? Should they use anonymous actors? What's the proper content of movies? All these are being debated during the 19-teens. But by 1920, the answer had been reached. By 1920, it was clear that a movie would be 90 minutes long. It was clear by 1920 that a movie would be expensively produced. It was clear by 1920 that it would tell a story. And it was clear by 1920 that films had to have recognizable stars to succeed. So it's during the 1920s that movies become big business. By 1929, 90 million Americans are going to the movies every week. That's compared to 5 million a week these days. But you have a population of only 120 million. That is, almost every American is going to the movies every week. Americans spent 10 times more money going to the movies than they did on all other forms of leisure put together. 90% of all money. And the movies, as I've tried to argue, became the real educators of American society. They helped create a new popular culture, a popular culture with common speech patterns, common dress, common behavior, common heroes. The movies would shape new ideas of masculinity and femininity, of sexuality and glamour. So let me digress for a brief moment and place all this in some kind of context. If you took a course in U.S. history and you focused on the 1920s, they would tell you about a cultural civil war that ravages the United States. And that cultural civil war fought over many issues. One issue was over religion. There were people who believed that the Bible should shape public education, and there were what were called modernists who were opposed to that. And this would all culminate in a story that you're all familiar with, the Scopes monkey trial. After a variety of states had made it illegal to teach evolution in the schools, a lawsuit emerged in Tennessee in which modernists fought against evangelicals over the teaching of evolution in the schools. Another key issue, another key battleground of the 1920s was alcohol and prohibition. Prohibition of alcohol had been adopted as a war measure during World War I and then was made permanent through a constitutional amendment. Modernists opposed prohibition, and more moral conservatives favored prohibition. Another key issue in this cultural civil war was immigration. Moral conservatives believed that immigrants were bringing foreign ideologies to the United States. And in 1924, they succeeded in placing very sharp restrictions on immigration of foreigners from Southern and Eastern Europe. Immigration was largely restricted to Northwestern Europe. This was a major battleground. Another major issue in this cultural civil war was a battle over the Ku Klux Klan. The Ku Klux Klan was enormously popular, not merely in the South, not merely in states like Texas, but in states like Indiana, California, and Oregon. And the major battles over the Ku Klux Klan ripped apart the Democratic Party in the 1920s. The Democratic Party was divided between Northern ethnics and white Southerners, and they clashed over the Ku Klux Klan. It would take 100 ballots to nominate a presidential nominee in 1924 because of the debate over the Ku Klux Klan. So you have a literal cultural civil war during the 1920s. You have bitter fights over anything imaginable. The state of Ohio, for example, passed a law limiting women to 1 inch of cleavage. The state of Utah passed a law that women could not have dresses more than 1 inch above their ankles. I mean, this is a real cultural civil war, not like the sort of phony cultural civil war we have in American society today. But in the end, that cultural civil war meant nothing. And the reason it meant nothing is because a new, what I'll call consumer culture, would triumph over all. And this would be the culture that Hollywood would popularize. It's a culture that emphasizes romance. It's a culture that emphasizes glamour. It's a culture that emphasizes mixed-sex fun. It's this culture that will be the culture that most Americans will respond to. Politicians may have liked them to fight this cultural civil war, but most Americans were not interested. They were interested in this new culture of glamour, and that's the culture that Hollywood is promoting. Hollywood would promote an exciting new way of life. The first major Western hero, if we could have the overhead projector, was named Tom Mix. And Tom Mix was a real Hollywood sort of person. He put his name on top of his house in a neon sign with 6-foot-high letters. That's the Hollywood way, right? Some Americans may care about politics, but most Americans cared about Tom Mix more. Gloria Swanson had a solid gold bathtub. Comedienne Marion Davies had a 14-karat plated gold ceiling in her bedroom. This was the way of life that would triumph in the 1920s. These are the aspirations. So while theologians are bitterly divided in battles between evangelicals and religious modernists, most Americans' eyes are on Hollywood. Hollywood would become synonymous with glamour, scandal, and titillation. One of the most prominent directors of the period was found murdered. Rumors began to flourish about homosexuality. 2 actresses' careers were in ruins as a result of this murder. Mabel Normand, who was the most important female comedian of the early period, and Mary Miles Minter, who embraced Taylor's body at his funeral and claimed that he told her he would come back to marry her from the dead. Clara Bow's career ended in scandal. Actor Wallace Reed committed suicide amid allegations of drug addiction. And the greatest scandal of all involved the figure who, apart from Charlie Chaplin, was the most popular comedian of his time, Fatty Arbuckle, who was acquitted of killing an actress after raping her with a liquor bottle. We'll talk more about that when we talk about censorship in Hollywood. So Hollywood would play a crucial role in overcoming a deep, divisive, cultural civil war that racked America in the aftermath of World War I. But the great irony is that the people who would create Hollywood culture, who would dominate it in the 1920s, were precisely this kind of people that the country was trying to keep out through the immigration restrictions of 1924. We live in a politically correct world, and for the most part, we don't talk much about the ethnic side of American life. Because when you talk about ethnicity, it's touchy, and you're almost certain to offend someone. But we can't talk about the movies without talking about ethnicity. Because Hollywood was founded, run, and dominated for more than 30 years by a very distinctive group of people. They were East European Jews and their children. Okay, so you have a relatively small group of people who will dominate the movie industry and have huge impact on American cultural life. And to me, this is very interesting, because we often think that our culture is shaped by majorities, but it's not at all shaped by majorities. Today, who shapes our music? Well, African Americans and Hispanics, right? That's where the driving force of American music comes from. Minorities can have a completely disproportionate impact on American culture, and that was very much the case in the 1920s. So what I want to do for the remainder of our class today, maybe we'll get a little further than that, is to talk about these people, Hollywood Jews, and the world that they created. And my argument is that the movies would reflect a specifically Jewish sensibility with all the contradictions that that contains. Now, to understand these figures, I think it's helpful to begin by mentioning a book called What Makes Sammy Run? It was a book written by a Hollywood Jew about other Hollywood Jews. And it's about what drives these people. And the answer to that question was self-hate and a desire for assimilation and acceptance. So what makes Sammy run is not just a desire to get rich, not just a desire to get ahead in the world, not just a desire to have all the luxuries that American society can afford. What really drives Sammy, according to this book, is self-hate and a desire for assimilation. And I think you can't understand Jewish Hollywood without understanding that. The storefront theaters of the late teens were transformed into movie palaces by Jewish exhibitors. And when sound movies appeared, the scripts were written by Jewish writers. The studio system, which made movies during Hollywood's heyday of the 30s and 40s, was run by second-generation Jewish immigrants. The most powerful talent agencies were run by Jews. In the mid-1930s, of the 85 Hollywood producers, 53 were Jewish. Now, the story of Jews in Hollywood is not simply a rags to riches story. It's not simply a story of people pulling themselves up by their bootstraps. It's not simply a success story. Because Jewish influence in Hollywood would always exact a heavy price. They would be the target for wave after wave of vicious anti-Semitism. It began in the 20s, and it would continue even up till today. In the 1920s, some ministers called for the liberation of the movies from, quote, the hands of the devil and 500 unchristian Jews. In the 1950s, red baiters called Judaism a form of communism and claimed that the movies were Jews' chief form of propaganda. And this hasn't wholly died away in recent magazines, like in a recent Red Book. Dolly Parton denounced Jewish control of Hollywood. Spike Lee had some not very sympathetic things to say. So this kind of image of Jewish dominance of Hollywood has gone on and on. Again and again, anti-Semites would charge that Jews used the movies to subvert traditional American values. But my argument's going to be almost the exact opposite of that. Hollywood's Jewish producers, Hollywood's Jewish directors, Hollywood's Jewish writers wanted to be American. They didn't want to be regarded as Jews. These people, more than anyone else, admired American society. And what they would do is they would create a dream image of America that would be enormously popular to not just the American public, but to the world. It's a fantasy image of America that they would create and popularize. It's the America they wished was America. It was the America they fantasized about. And that fantasy touched nerves with millions and millions of people. So they would create a fantasy that was so powerful that it would shape this country's myths, values, and traditions of America itself. So let's talk a bit about this, about who these men were and what kind of movies they would create. The men who created Hollywood were a remarkably homogeneous group. Virtually unanimously, they had grown up in poverty in Eastern Europe. Every single one of them had a father who was an utter failure. All were united in their rejection of the past. All were utterly devoted to their new country. These were not immigrants who dreamed of going home again. They never wanted to see Lithuania or Poland or any other part of Eastern Europe again. They came to the United States at the beginning of the 20th century when xenophobia, that's hatred of immigrants, was rampant. The self-appointed defenders of a more traditional America wanted to prevent Jews from tainting the country. And so those people established quotas at universities to keep Jews out. They established barriers to allowing Jews in law firms. They established barriers on Jewish entry into medical schools. And so one reason that Jews went into movies was precisely because the movies were disreputable, precisely because that wasn't an area that WASPs wanted to go into. There were none of the impediments that more prestigious professions used to keep Jews out. You could open a theater for less than $400 if you could scrape that together. Jews had certain advantages in the film industry. Many of the future executives had worked in fashion. And if you work in fashion, you quickly understand how quickly public taste changes. They had a peculiar sensitivity to the dreams and aspirations of immigrants and working class families. And that, of course, is their basic audience. And they also had fewer inhibitions over sex than did the more traditional embodiments of Victorian or genteel culture. But the chief appeal of the movies to these Jewish executives was that they could create a world of the imagination. These were people who had come from truly miserable lives. And they don't want to depict those miserable lives on the screen. They want to depict a fantasy world. A world where fathers are strong, not weak. A world where families are stable, not broken. A world where people are attractive, resilient, resourceful, and decent. It's a fantasy world. It's not the real America, but it's the America they wanted to see, and it's the America that their audience wanted to embrace. So movies aren't a mirror of society, right? Movies are never a reflection of society. They're a reflection of our fantasies, hopes, and fears, but not of the real world, and especially for these executives who wanted a world of the imagination. This was their America, and this was their most enduring legacy. And so the argument I'm going to make to you is that the movies they would make are very much a reaction against the realities of their own lives. They're reacting against their own world, where fathers were weak, families were unstable, people were unattractive and impractical. That's not the world they wanted. So what these men would do is to create a shadow America, an ideal America. And in so doing, they shaped the American imagination and they defined American values. So what these moguls would do is they created a fantasy America far more glamorous, far more adventurous than was WASP reality. It was an America in which social divisions would be closed, where the rich would learn humility, and where the poor would marry their bosses, and everything would end in Cinderella-like fantasy. And this was the image that they would propel. Now, there were many Jewish moguls, and each of them had a somewhat different fantasy. The Warner Brothers would create pictures that were blunt and tough and fast-paced. Their fantasies were urban and contemporary. Their films were timely and topical, but never typical. They drew their inspiration from the newspapers. Warner Brothers had stars of the first magnitude, but their stars were not Hollywood images of glamour and romance. Jimmy Cagney's no image of glamour and romance, nor is Humphrey Bogart, nor Edward G. Robinson, nor the fast, tough-talking Bette Davis, but they represent a certain kind of fantasy, a fantasy where ethnic kinds of people are superior to everyone around them. These actors are smart, urban, small, and explosive. The women are hard-bitten and cynical. When Warner Brothers makes cartoons, what kind of cartoons do they make? They make Bugs Bunny cartoons, right? The same as the kind of actors and actresses that they used. Smart and cynical. This is their fantasy world. Harry Cohn ran Columbia Pictures, And he had a very different fantasy of America. His fantasy was summed up by Gary Cooper and Jimmy Stewart. That is, an America where people are decent and blessed with innocent wisdom. People like Tom Hanks, right? He's the sort of Jimmy Stewart, Henry Fonda figure of our time. And that's a different fantasy than the Warner Brothers fantasy. Now, Harry Cohn's most successful director was an Italian immigrant named Frank Capra. And Capra would very much popularize these images of fantasies of Cohn. But what's interesting is that there would be the decency on one side, but there's clearly a subtext too, because for every decent person there has to be somebody who's not decent, somebody who's cheating, someone who's lying, someone who's hypocritical, someone who's corrupt, someone who's manipulative. And so the fantasy of Jimmy Stewart and Gary Cooper all depends on there being another side as well, a shady side to America that's usually played by clearly defined WASP establishment type characters. The villains in Columbia's pictures were ruthless industrialists exploiting the symbols of democracy for their own ends. These films pit the common against the rich and the mighty, the innocent against the shrewd, the individual against the corporation, the traditional against the new. But Cohn had another fantasy as well, apart from the Jimmy Stewart fantasy. And this were people who are truly emblems of glamour. Cary Grant, Barbara Stanwyck. They live in a completely different world, a world where houses are spacious, money is plentiful, and style abundant. So if one of his fantasies is the ordinary man, his other fantasy is the man from Dream City, Cary Grant, who rises above it all. Now, Cary Grant, I should just add, came from a background not all that dissimilar from Charlie Chaplin's. Slum background in London, broken family. He may have been Jewish in ancestry, but he, of course, doesn't symbolize any of that, right? He symbolizes wealth and self-esteem and confidence and glamour, and that was another of these fantasies. Adolf Zucker built Paramount Pictures, and his pictures, too, purred with sophistication. Zucker imagined movies as a source of intellectual elevation. He established a school at Paramount on the lot to teach young actors and actresses decorum. He even offered them classes in literature and sociology. But his vision of sophistication was truly international. He wasn't just interested in American talent, he was interested in international talent. He brought back Maurice Chevalier, Joseph von Sternberg, and Marlene Dietrich. He even enticed the famous Soviet director, Sergei Eisenstein, to Hollywood. So his vision of glamour is the most international vision of what the world can offer. Carroll Laemmle founded Universal Pictures. Remember, he's the man who invented the star system, and he was the oldest of the Hollywood Jews. And Universal Pictures did not appeal to urban sophisticates like Warner Brothers. It appealed to rural audiences. Carroll Laemmle stayed far away from the risque and the suggestive. So what kind of movies would you make for a rural audience, for ordinary Americans? What kind of fantasy do you think he might have had, if you had to think of one?
Didn't he do Wizard of Oz?
Later, that would be an MGM movie, but Westerns. I mean, that's another fantasy of America. He made Westerns, and he made horror movies. The Westerns harken back, he didn't know anything about the real West. He had read dime novels in Germany. In Germany, the most popular form of fiction is Western novels. And he imagined America as a vigorous landscape of cowboys and Indians. And that's the kind of movies he created. He didn't care what the real West was like, because they're not interested in the real America. They're interested in this fantasy America. In film after film, he depicts a shiftless cowpoke who arrives in town, falls in love with a local woman, but she's already coveted by the town sharpie who abducts her and attempts to frame the cowpoke. In the end, of course, the hero clears his name and wins the girl. The other kind of movie that Laemmle made at Universal was the horror film. And all the famous horror films of Hollywood history were made by Universal. Frankenstein, Dracula, The Mummy, and these too were influenced by his European background. They used sets inspired by German Expressionism. There were encroaching shadows, huge dark sets, a fixation on man's relationship to fate and nature, and everything seems grotesque. Louis B. Mayer headed MGM, and he was obsessed with making his studio the best. Even during the worst years of the Great Depression, his pictures' budgets averaged at least $150,000 more per film than any other studios. And his fantasies all portrayed an era of unreality. He, too, wanted a cosmopolitan, a sophisticated world of glamour and wealth. And especially he popularized the image of the unapproachable sex goddess. The women in MGM films were beautiful, elegant, smart, but they were also coolly unapproachable. Greta Garbo was the essence of the Louis B. Mayer woman. She was unspeakably divine. She had large, languid eyes, ascending cheekbones and brows, and a long, severe mouth. All MGM women were what I would call stylized. They didn't want to look natural. They were meant to look unapproachable. You've all seen pictures of Joan Crawford or Norma Shearer or Jean Harlow or Myrna Loy with their carefully constructed eyebrows, with their perfect complexions. So what Louis B. Mayer was seeking was sophistication, cosmopolitanism, and style. The male stars, too, were tall and stylish. You're all probably familiar with Clark Gable. By the time we're done with our course, you'll be familiar with William Powell as well. Mayer also created movies that played out fantasies of family and security. This was a vision of small-town America with simple pieties, and those films would star Mickey Rooney or later Judy Garland. Right. So what you have is something extraordinary. Men who came from utter poverty in Europe, from families that had fallen to pieces, from striving, and they came to America with a fantasy of what America should be. And while the reality of America was very unlike that image, they made movies about the image, and that's what people would respond to. So while in recent years, figures like Dolly Parton have denounced Jewish domination of Hollywood, the great irony is that Hollywood's Jews have never promoted a specifically Jewish agenda. They never wanted to create Jewish movies. And they've only made a handful in the whole history of Hollywood. The Hollywood Jews did not believe in multiculturalism. They did not believe in cultural pluralism. They wanted a unified American culture. But a fantasy culture, a culture in which all ethnic and class divisions could be overcome. That was their fantasy. And Hollywood's Jews would use the movies to promote that vision. Whatever their personal political views, they steered clear of promoting hidden agendas of their own. We're going to move a little farther, and we're going to talk about the birth of sound films. In 1925, Sam Warner invited his older brother Harry to a meeting that would change the course of movie history. It was a demonstration of sound. And Harry Warner saw it, and he responded, "Who wants to hear actors talk?" But Warner Brothers was on the verge of bankruptcy. It was the least successful of all the new studios. And when you're on the verge of bankruptcy and you are desperate, it is time to spin the dice. And so Warner Brothers made an alliance with Western Electric. Back when we used to have one phone company in this country, Ma Bell, Western Electric manufactured the equipment for the phone company. And together, Western Electric and Warner Brothers established Vitaphone. And Vitaphone's not a very sophisticated system of sound. It looks just like the old LPs. You'd have a 16-inch cylinder record, and you'd have to somehow synchronize that to a movie. And can you imagine how tough that would be to get the needle down at exactly the right point? Because if you don't do it right, then when the vase falls off the tabletop, you hear the telephone ring, right? It just doesn't work right. Jack Warner prepared a feature with a musical soundtrack, Don Juan, starring John Barrymore, and the day after the premiere of the film, Warner Brothers stock soared from $8 to $65. Sounds like the age of the internet. But it bears more resemblances to the age of the internet, I'm afraid, than he would have wished. Wall Street was convinced that sound movies were the wave of the future, but the industry itself was not. It would be very expensive to electrify the theaters. The Vitaphone was exceedingly cumbersome and unreliable, and so most theaters simply refused to install devices allowing them to play sound movies. And so, in 1926, Warner Brothers lost $1 million, back when $1 million was real money. So, Warner's is now desperate. And Warner's decides that it needs to create feature-length sound movies. And it does it once, and it's a failure. And it does it a second time, and it's a failure. And it does a third movie, and it's a failure. And then the fourth opened October 6th, 1927. The evening was brisk. The evening was clear. The theater on Broadway was filled with notables. One Paramount executive raced into the lobby during intermission and called his boss in California, saying, "This is a revolution." The next morning, Adolf Zucker called 50 Paramount execs to his hotel suite and demanded to know why they hadn't made a sound movie. And the reason that that movie made a difference is because someone spoke. There had been lots of movies with music. And there had been every earlier attempt to make a sound movie had had a recorded soundtrack. But the jazz singer starring Al Jolson was new because he spoke. And he didn't speak much. Al Jolson, Jewish, born in Lithuania, had made the first feature movie with speech. But that movie wasn't just a movie with sound. It also was the story of the Hollywood Jews. Hollywood begins with a paradox. The industry is the very essence of what we mean by America, but it was dominated by East European Jews who were anything but the essence of America. The studio system was supervised by a second generation of Jews. Their dominance of the industry made them easy targets for wave after wave of vicious anti-Semitism. It was argued that Jews used film to undermine traditional American values, but just the opposite was the case. Hollywood Jews desperately embraced mainstream American values. They wanted to be regarded as Americans and not as Jews. And so next week we'll begin with The Jazz Singer, the film that ushered in sound and told their story.